I feel we have the history on our shoulders.
All the tradition of our history, our songs, this part of the history of our country, all were gone and finished.
Tom, thank you for coming back.
Pleasure, Dan, as ever.
I mean, I am not alone. I was not alone in thinking you were a bit eccentric. Tom Holland, the genius writer, the man who's beguiled millions of readers all over the world, desperate they all were for you to finish your massive task of your lifetime, which is writing the great history of the Roman Empire in the West. And yet you took all this time out to write this kind of crazy book about Christianity. I was not alone in thinking you were crazy, and I was completely wrong, because it's a work of genius. But why? So why did you want to write this, and what did you want to say in it?
Well, it's as you'll know, people will often say that it's works of fiction, it's novels that are personal. But you'll know that works of non-fiction as well often draw deep on the well springs of childhood obsessions or youthful passions, and that's absolutely the case with my interest in ancient history. It was a kind of seamless evolution from my fascination with dinosaurs, big, fierce, glamorous, extinct, and then I moved seamlessly on to ancient empires. And I always identified with the strong men of Greece and Rome, and I always regarded the biblical stories as being a bit boring, to be honest, in comparison. Not in themselves. I mean, I loved all the accounts of the Assyrians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians, but the children of Israel themselves didn't really measure up compared to these great empires. And in the New Testament, to be honest, I was absolutely on the side of Pontius Pilate as opposed to Jesus. So as a result of that, my sense of identification when I came to initially to write history was very much with these kind of uber predators, these tyrannosaurs of the ancient world. But the process of writing about Caesar, about Leonidas, trying to get inside the minds of the Romans, of the Spartans, of the Assyrians, I began to find them increasingly alien and not a little bit frightening. And to be honest, it was the kind of the innocent quality of their callousness that unsettled me. And so inevitably I began to wonder, well, what happened? What explains the kind of evolution of thought that means that now, rather than praising the Spartans for chucking babies who may not measure up to their standards of citizenship down a ravine, we're now appalled by that. Why now do we go to such efforts to keep young children when they're born maybe on life support? You know, what explains this vast process of change? I mean, that's just one example. But in almost every way, the resemblance between, say, the Roman world and ours, they are faux amis. They may seem to be similar, but in the more you look at it, the more you realise how different they are, how alien, how strange. And that's even on the most fundamental level, so things like sexuality, things like that. So over the process of the past few years, I've been recalibrating exactly where it is that I morally, ethically, culturally come from, and essentially where the whole of Western society comes from. And I've come to the conclusion, rather like someone looking, you know, can't quite identify an itch on the back, and then you find it and it's really great when you scratch it. I've come to the conclusion that essentially I am Christian. I am not classically Greek or Roman. I am essentially Christian, and I think that you are, even though you might deny that. I think the whole of the society, Western society that we've grown up is. And I think essentially we are all goldfish, and the water in which we are swimming is Christian, which is not to say that we all are confessional Christians. We may not believe that the Lord Jesus Christ rose on the third day. But if we think of Christianity as a kind of civilization, a matrix, a way of seeing and understanding the world, and one above all that has grounded kind of revolutionary concepts like progress, reformatio, revolution at its heart, then we can see how the very fact that the past 2,000 years of Western history have been so unstable, the fact that it has changed so much is also tribute to the fact about something that hasn't changed, which is that the impulses and the well springs of this process derive from the one source, which I think is Christianity. So that essentially is the argument of the book. And so for someone who has spent most of his time writing about antiquity, it's an incredibly exciting project. Firstly, because you are actually tracing the influence of something that derives from antiquity right the way through time, right the way up to the present. And also because it enabled me to write about periods of history that I've always been fascinated by, but haven't until now had the opportunity to write about. So I've written about
The 18th
medieval
century.
history, yes, absolutely.
You lucky
Early
thing.
modern history, 18th century, right the way up into the 20th century. And it's, as it happens, enabled me to write about all kinds of things, again, that interest me from childhood. From dinosaurs. Dinosaurs feature prominently, in the chapter on science. Beetles, whatever. It's all there. So it's although a book that I hope is objective, that I hope is fair, nevertheless it is also a deeply personal book, and it's personal because I think that writing about this subject, whether you do it from a position of faith, of atheism, of agnosticism, nevertheless this subject is personal to you because you have been shaped by it.
Why? Can you explain to me how revolutionary Christianity was in its early form?
Well, I think that Paul, who is the earliest Christian sources, the letters written within a couple of decades of the crucifixion, he places at the heart of his message the idea that the Messiah has come, that he didn't come in martial glory to liberate the people of Israel from the Romans, but he was nailed to a cross and suffered death as a slave. And yet, this humiliating death has been experienced by Paul and by others like him as, in a blinding flash of revelation, that this is the beginning of a new covenant. And Paul says that this understanding of the crucifixion of a slave, the worst imaginable death, the most humiliating death, that in some way this has totally set the world on a new axis, that this is a stumbling block to the Jews and it is folly to everyone else. And it's a stumbling block to the Jews because, of course, the idea that the Messiah had basically been a failure is shocking. And yet Paul says that he's drawing this conclusion clearly from his understanding of the Jewish scriptures, from the way in which actually going through the Jewish scriptures, the all-powerful God, the creator of heaven and earth, seems to have identified with losers, with those at the bottom of the heap, with those who get kicked around, with those who have sand kicked in their face by the local bullies. But it's also a stumbling block to the Jews, of course, because in some mysterious way, which Paul and all his recipients again seem to accept, and Paul is kind of groping after a way to explain it, this slave who was nailed to a cross in some mysterious way was a part of the one creator God. And so that therefore implies that there is a kind of potency in suffering, in defeat, in being the lowest of the low, that is incredibly subversive of just about everything that people in the 1st century AD take for granted. On top of that, Paul is saying that this new covenant supersedes the covenant that had existed between the children of Israel and God. That now this covenant is for everybody across the face of the earth. There is no Greek or Jew, Paul says. There is no man or woman. There is no slave or free. And he founds this sense, this sublime sense of human dignity on the notion that all human beings are created in the image of God, and now God has sacrificed himself so that all may be freed, all may share in the liberation that Paul is preaching. And so that gives both a sense of dignity to the lowest of the low, but it also provides a universal context for that. It proclaims that the ideal is not, as the Jews had hitherto thought, in a kind of exclusiveness, but in a universalism. So these are radical ideas, that the weak have a peculiar dignity, that all human beings are created equally in the image of God. And these are subversive of the way that Jews have thought of their relationship to God, but of course transplanted to the Greco-Roman world, it is equally subversive. And it's particularly subversive in the way that it shrines the idea that defeat can be a form of victory. And so these then reverberate through the decades, the centuries, and the millennia that follow. And the Christian church emerges like a kind of cuckoo in the imperial nest, because the emphasis on caring for those who are weak, those who are at the bottom of the pile, expresses itself through a radical new doctrine of charity, of giving. You know, the rich give to the poor to store up treasure for themselves in heaven. This is not designed, as systems were in Greek cities or in Rome, as forms of patronage. This is a giving that is done because God wants it, and because the weak, the poor, the orphans, the widows, the old people, these have a dignity. And so when Constantine becomes emperor, when Constantine, the emperor, becomes a Christian, this kind of welfare state that exists within the Roman Empire is then given an imperial dignity as well. And this then enables, when the Roman Empire in the West crumbles away, the church endures and survives. And when Gibbon argues that Christianity sapped the will of the Romans, that it kind of corroded the foundations of the Roman state, he gets it exactly wrong. It is Christianity that enables what remains of Roman culture to survive into the future, but of course transformed and transmuted. And in a sense, the primal revolution consists of the way in which Paul and people like him, people proclaiming that this slave nailed to a cross is in some way coterminous with the one creator. This is the kind of the primal revolution. This is the primal earth shock. But further reverberations continue to ripple through history. And particularly the form that Christianity takes in the Latin West, where there is no emperor as there is in Constantinople. And so what happens in the Latin West in the early Middle Ages is that the church accrues a kind of growing sense of its own dignity. It emancipates itself from the idea that it is dependent on emperors, or more specifically on a particular empire. So that when in 410 Rome is sacked, and people who lament the passing of the old ways say that because we have abandoned the old gods, therefore the gods have abandoned Rome. Probably the most influential of the Latin fathers, Augustine, says no, we have the city of man, and that is ephemeral. It's bubbles on the flow of time. And he gives a word to this, saeculum. And the Latin word saeculum means the limit of living memory. So the flux, everything comes and it goes and it changes. And all of Roman power are merely winking bubbles on the flow of the saeculum. And he opposes to that the city of God, which is eternal and unchanging. And the only way that human beings can resist the flow of the saeculum is to secure a firm binding, bind themselves as closely as they can to this vision of unchanging eternity. And a binding in Latin is a religio. And it might be a sacrifice, it might be a festival, it might be a priesthood. But in the Christian world, where there can be only one religio comes to be, it comes to describe the process by which someone who particularly wants to consecrate him or herself to God, maybe as a monk, maybe as a nun, maybe as a hermit, that's what religio is. And so religio comes to be counterpointed to the flux of the saeculum. And in the 11th century, this is weaponized by radicals who in an earlier generation would have been described as heretics. And they want to apply the notion of reformatio, of remaking yourself, that is kind of fundamental to the Christian idea of the self, the idea that you can be baptized, that your sins can be washed away, that you can be born again, you can be cleansed anew, that you can be illuminated by the light of proper understanding, by the light of the Spirit. And they want to apply this to the dimension of the entire world. And to do this, they draw on ideas of the saeculum and of a church that should be properly consecrated to God. And so they want to wash off the grubby finger marks of kings and emperors who have been pouring at the sacral purity of the church as they see it. And so through a convulsive process, they separate the church from the fabric of the state as the various kingdoms and imperial entities that exist throughout the Latin West. And they do this by humbling kings. So Henry IV, the emperor, is humiliatingly reduced to waiting outside the Pope's castle. They inspire ideologically motivated warriors to travel to the ends of the earth in the cause of consecrating the earth to this vision of purity and liberty. Those are the Crusades. They mandate lawyers to fashion entire frameworks of international law that can, in a sense, consecrate the church as the first modern state, a state that lays claim to its own sovereignty, that enshrines the legal system of the church as the ultimate source of recall for people across everywhere in Christendom, and the Pope himself at the head of it. And the people who structure these are the canonists, the canon lawyers, who fairly soon are inscribing as a right of the poor. That up until then it had been thought that the rich have a duty to give to the poor, but these canon lawyers start to inscribe in the frameworks of law that are applied across Christendom that the poor and the weak have a right. And so we're getting the birth of some very radical notions there as well. So the Middle Ages, far from being a kind of ossified, frozen period of time, are absolutely the opposite. This is a convulsive process of revolution, and it establishes a kind of archetype of reformatio, of reformation, of revolution that will repeat over and over again throughout European history from then on. Because, of course, at the heart of Christianity is the principle that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. But the problem with that is that every revolution throws up new elites, and in time those elites become oppressive, they become hegemonic, they become rich, they become self-satisfied, and that in turn prompts within the breasts of Christians the yearning for a fresh reformatio. And so what we call the Reformation is merely the second experience of reformatio that Europe's had. And again, we see this idea of kings being humbled, of ideologically motivated warriors going to the ends of the world, of people, entire orders of subversive revolutionaries laying claim to the notion that they have been enlightened, that they have obtained a form of enlightenment. And again, you can see again that this will replicate itself with the French Revolution, with the Russian Revolution into the 60s. And so in a sense, we absolutely remain the heirs of that process. And we take it so for granted that we don't see how culturally contingent it is. That's an inordinately long answer to your question. That in essence is what is revolutionary about Christianity, is that it shrines at the heart of the civilization of what becomes the West, the idea that there can be progress and that there should be change.
Discover the past with exclusive ancient history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything from the wonders of Pompeii to the rebellion of Boudica and the mysteries of prehistoric Scotland. Immerse yourself in the captivating stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
I guess my obviously that's incredibly compelling. I guess my only thought is how much comparative history do you have to look at Japan, South Asia, Central American civilizations or do you not need to sort of look at it in terms of a kind of a laboratory testing of these ideas?
Well, I think you have to test, for instance, the proposition that a notion of the saeculum, a notion of what will become the secular, is distinctive to Western Christendom, and that clearly seems to me the case. And one of the things that complicates this is that we speak European languages, and European languages are saturated in Christian assumptions, and we, over the course of our history, have then taken these languages and implanted them in other reaches of the world. So in India, for instance, you will get people who speak English, better than I do. But in speaking English, they are using words that are freighted with Christian assumptions. And so secular would absolutely be one of them. By the time the British are going to India, they are doing so as Protestants who have developed a very different sense of what secular means to what it had meant in the heyday of the Middle Ages, still more in the age of Augustine, because with the Reformation, the notion of religio as being something distinctive to monks or nuns, it's been democratized. Everyone now has a religio, so a sense of a kind of personal bond with the divine. But at the same time, religion, the anglicization of this Latin word religio, also means something that is distinct from what's coming to be called the secular. So you can say, what is the religion in England? What should it be? This is the great issue that the Civil War is fought over. What is religion in France? What is religion in the land of the Turks? And what is the religion in Hindustan, in the land of the Hindus, in the land of the Indians? And the British go there and say, what is the religion? And it's an insane question, because they don't have a religion. I mean, religion would have meant nothing to a Christian in the Middle Ages, still less to a Hindu, an Indian, because it's simply not a conceptualization that they have. But the British are able to kind of, rather like Procrustes, the robber in the Legend of Theseus.
Cannibal.
Yes, who has a magical bed, and he either stretches people or he lops limbs off to make them fit this magical bed. That's basically what the British do. They go there and they see that the Hindus have temples, and they have what appear to be priests, and they have what appear to be scriptures, and so they construct something, a religion of the Hindus, which they start by the turn of the 18th, 19th century to call Hinduism. And they say, well, this is the religion of the Hindus. And then they say, well, there is this secular space, and there's the religion of the Hindus, the religion of Islam, there's all the various religion of the Buddhists, whatever, and they construct these images that are patterned on Christianity. And so, although the British do not convert India to Christianity in the way that, say, the Spanish convert the Mexicans to Christianity, nevertheless, when the Raj ends, when India becomes independent, it becomes independent as a secular state. That's written into the constitution. And this reflects a kind of assumption that the Indian elite, all of whom have been educated in British schools and who reflect the stamp of kind of the English language and the freight of assumptions that it carries, that the secular is an unproblematic term, that everyone's had this notion of the secular, but they haven't. And this is increasingly being pointed out by Indian scholars. So one of them, who I quote in the book, says that the process of Christianization happens in two ways. It happens through conversion, and it happens through secularization. And he's absolutely right. And in a sense, what's happening in India at the moment with Modi and the rise of what we would in the West call Hindu nationalism, actually it's a reaction, and it may be inchoate rather than reasoned, but it's a reaction against the sense that actually the notion of the secular, the notion of something called Hinduism being a religion, is an alien import. It is an alien way of seeing the world. And yet because we are the goldfish swimming in this, in this water, we don't see it. We don't recognize that we're in water. We don't recognize we're in a bowl. And the ambition of the book is to kind of try and open the eyes of people, of readers, to the fact, we are in a bowl, and this bowl has a very distinctive contour and shape.
So let's talk about this goldfish here, Dan in his bowl. Okay, so I'm somebody, as you know, who does not believe that the world was created in 7 days by God. I don't go to church. I don't believe in I'm not a practicing believer. I am an atheist, and yet you are telling me that atheism itself.
You call yourself a humanist.
Humanist.
You would define yourself as a humanist.
Yeah. So you are saying that
the foundation of humanism is quite a strange one. It's the notion that humans have a distinct status, that they are somehow special. Where does this conviction come from? This idea that humanity somehow has a kind of universal dignity. Well, it doesn't come from the Greeks. It doesn't come from the Romans. It comes essentially from Genesis, the very book that you've just poo-pooed. Because in Genesis, it says that God creates man and woman in his own image. And so for Jews and Christians, man and woman has an inherent dignity that is much greater than that, really, of any other civilization. It's a kind of universal dignity. And humanism is essentially an attempt to abstract this notion from the kind of the matrix of Christianity, and to allow it to kind of live without the cultural framework that had originally given it its life force.
Yes, but all the spiritual framework.
Yeah, the spiritual framework.
But isn't that okay? I mean, isn't it okay?
It's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fine.
Yeah.
But it is a faith position, and it is no less a faith position than that of a Protestant or a Catholic, and it is recognisably bred of the marrow of Christian civilization. And you would not be a humanist were it not for the fact that you live in a society shaped by Christian assumptions. And in a way, much of intellectual culture in the West over the past 150 years has been an attempt by various people who no longer believe in the Christian God to find a justification for the beliefs that derive from Christianity. So it may be, by saying I'm a humanist. It may be by saying I'm a Marxist. And Marx's great pretense is that his indignation at the sufferings of the poor at the hands of the rich, his conviction that there will be a day of judgment when the poor will inherit the earth and the rich will be cast down. His conceit is that he has derived all this from the purely objective number crunching that he's been doing in the reading room at the British Library. But it's evident when you read Marx that his indignation at the suffering of those who are evicted by rapacious landlords, children who go blind from working in factories late into the night, people in far-off colonies oppressed so that the bourgeoisie can have sugar for their tea. This is animated by something that goes way beyond his number crunching. This is animated by a deep moral conviction that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And Marx, by virtue of his descent from a line of Jews who convert to Lutheranism, is clearly drawing on the moral inheritance of both Jewish and Christian teachings. And yet, if you become a Marxist, you can buy into this inheritance of teachings without actually having to buy into Christian belief. Similarly, the construction in 19th century of a concept called science, which, science simply means a kind of a framework of knowledge. People have been studying sciences in universities, Christian institutions, of course, since the High Middle Ages. But the notion that there is something called science, this is a kind of a conceptualization of the mid-19th century. And so you say, well, what is science? People now tend to assume that science, again, a bit like the secular, is just something that's always existed. It's always been there. You have debates about did the Greek, what was the contribution of the Greeks to science? What was the contribution of the Muslim Caliphate to science? But it's hopelessly anachronistic. Science is constructed at a time when the notion of religion has as a category has essentially evolved over the preceding centuries. Science is constructed as its doppelganger. Science is constructed to be what religion is not. And yet, as is the way with doppelgangers, it bears the stamp of what it's rejecting. So what you will find with people who are not the people who are doing what we might call science, but people who are promoting science as a solution to the superstition that is supposedly embodied in something called religion. People who write in that kind of way, what they're doing is saying, science enables us to banish superstition. It enables us to bring the people who had walked in darkness into a great light. It enables us to understand the way that we should live our lives properly. And those who promote and propagate this perspective cast themselves as moral arbiters. They have no hesitation in saying what is right and wrong. And in doing that, of course, they are betraying their origins in Protestant assumptions about Catholicism. The whole narrative that is constructed in the 19th century, that there's been a kind of age-old war between something called religion and something called science, this is simply an expression of the kind of the age-old, the traditional Protestant animus against Catholicism, except that it's now including Protestantism itself within its targets. But someone like Richard Dawkins is an infinite, is an incredibly Christian figure. The morality that he's preaching clearly draws from the inheritance of the English Protestantism that in which he was born. It's just that he's now including Christianity as something that he's condemning, and he's replaced it with something called science. But at its core, humanists, Marxists, those who think that science teaches us liberal values, all that they're doing is grappling around for some way, some prop, some way in which they can justify clinging on to Christian morality without Christian belief.
But isn't that scrabbling around necessary if you decide that you quite like Christian morality? You think that Jesus and Paul were extraordinary and transformative philosophers, thinkers, but you don't believe that Jesus was a deity?
Of course. If you lose your faith, then you have to find some other way of. But you want to keep hold of the package, then you have to find some other way. But the problem is that, as we know from the history of the 20th century, that actually, if you get rid of Christian belief, then it becomes quite easy to get rid of the Christian values as well. And of course, the philosopher who famously points this out is Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's most famous parable is of the killing of God, and the person who proclaims that God is dead and that we have killed him, we humanity have killed him, at first is ignored. People don't believe him, because although God is dead, his corpse lies in the cave, its shadows still seem to move. And so Nietzsche says that after a crime of such a scale, people will continue to believe that God is dead that God is alive for many centuries, even though in fact it's corpse, it's cold, it's gone forever. And the object of this parable isn't so much believing Christians, people who continue to go to church and to believe that God exists and that Christ rose on the third day. Rather, it's the people that I've just been talking about. It's the humanists, it's the liberals, it's the socialists, it's the communists, it's the philosophers. It's people who imagine that they can cling on to Christian morality without Christian belief. And Nietzsche says that, this will go because a new order will arise and great process of convulsion. Supermen will arise who will no longer need to be bound by this morality of a murdered God. And this, of course, was hugely influential in the wake of the First World War first on Mussolini and then on the Nazis. And Himmler says, just as Dawkins or a Marxist or anyone might say, that there's nothing special about humans. You know, we're all just organisms. There's nothing special about humans. We're just animals like any other animal. And therefore, people who promote the idea that humans have there's anything special about humans are deluded. And that then provides the basis for the ideological justification for what he and the Nazis generally set out to do. And they set out very, very consciously to trample down two of the core Christian teachings. One, that all human beings, humanism essentially, that all human beings are created equal and have an equal dignity. And secondly, that the weak have a special status, a special hold, that the strong have a responsibility to the weak, that the powerful have a responsibility to the powerless. These are the two fundamental Christian teachings that the Nazis set themselves to repudiate with genocidal effect. And in the wake of the Second World War, in the wake of the Holocaust, in the wake of the elimination of those who are condemned by the Nazis as mentally or physically defective, in the wake of the murder of an entire races of people because they are assumed to be subhuman, in the post-war West, the experience of this is felt as such a shock, as such a blasphemy, that it imprints the Christian ideals that have been offended by the Nazis as ideals to be upheld that can be believed in without necessarily believing in the religion that had given them birth. And so rather than the devil, Hitler gets enshrined as the embodiment of purest evil. Rather than believe in hell, we have the image of Auschwitz. And we no longer need to articulate evil in an overtly Christian way because we have evil with flags and swastikas and black uniforms and louse-ridden people being herded into gas chambers before us. But the question we face, and I think it's one that recent events have brought very much into saliency, is whether that's enough. And we increasingly see that liberals, progressives, when they're confronted by people who may not necessarily agree with liberal principles or progressive principles, what recourse do liberals or progressives have to convince people that actually all human beings are equal, that the strong, the rich do have a duty of care to the weak and to the poor? Basically, they shout Nazi. And the question has to be, what happens when people turn around and go, yeah, and? Because what we lack is the theological seedbed, the cultural seedbed, the seedbed of that enormous inheritance of Christian belief and practice and ritual that has sustained these beliefs for 2,000 years. If they're gone, can these beliefs be sustained? That's the huge question. And that's the question that Nietzsche in particular asked. And it's one to which I don't know the answer. Unfortunately, I'm not a futurologist, but I think it is a question that has to shadow us.
But isn't that what humans do? I mean, we adopt things from the past while jettisoning parts. I mean, I understand, of course, your point. Without that giant mechanism, without the structure around us, we may go very awry. But don't we borrow ideas of democracy from ancient Athens? We borrow ideas, our morality from various source, Christian and other sources in the East and things.
Well, like what? I mean, what are the influences in the East that have powerfully informed? Western morality.
No, sorry, not Western morality, but Confucianism, right? So in China.
I don't think that Confucianism has had any influence on us.
Oh, not us, no, but
No, but
people in the East. People in
but that's
China.
what I'm saying is that, you see, the Christian conviction that everyone should be Christian, that Christ says to his disciples before he goes to heaven, go out and preach the gospel to every corner of the world. And Christians have done that. And it's been the enduring conceit of Christians that the way that they understand the world should probably be the way that all the world understands the world. And so that's why it's this incredibly potent missionary force.
Universal.
Yes, the idea that its values properly should be universal. What happened over the course of the 19th century as various missionaries, not missionaries, but the imperial powers, so the British, French, whoever, the Americans even, realised that they weren't going to convert the entire world to Christianity, and yet they wanted to impose their values on people. So slavery would be the classic example. Slavery, the conviction that slavery is wrong emerges from a very particular climate of radical Protestantism. It's Quakers, then it's self-proclaimed evangelicals, and it's this very, very distinctive form of Protestantism that kind of just catches flame and ends up obliging Lord Castlereagh, against his better judgment, to go to the Congress of Vienna and to argue that slavery should be abolished. But the people that Castlereagh is arguing with are essentially Catholic powers, France, Portugal, Spain. So he can't couch his arguments in terms that are, in the evangelical terms. He doesn't really believe in it anyway. So to convince the Catholic powers, he gropes after this ancient Catholic idea of rights that which is embedded in canon law, which had already been invoked by Spanish friars in the 16th century. So it wasn't a wholly alien notion to them. And Castlereagh fuses the kind of the evangelical conviction that slavery is wrong with a kind of Catholic canon law assumption that every human being has rights, and fuses it and creates essentially a framework of what we would now call international law. And the way that this works is it's constructed to be something that both Catholics and Protestants can accept. So it can't be branded as Protestant or as Catholic or even as Christian, because in due course British abolitionists start to target Muslims, and when they're not going to convince Muslims, sultans or whatever, to abolish the slave trade if they're saying you've got to do this because the Lord Jesus Christ wants you to, or because canon lawyers in medieval Christendom said that it was wrong. So when the British are asked to join in the Crimean War by Constantinople, and they say, well, we will, but you've got to regulate and control and abolish vast sections of the slave trade, and the Sultan has to do this. It's deeply humiliating for him, because objectively he's being forced to do something because a load of Christians have told him to do it. It's palliated by the fact that British plenipotentiaries are able to disguise this Christian framework by saying, well, actually, this is a symbol, this is a framework of international law, and Islam can be integrated with international law just as much as Christianity can be, which isn't true. But it becomes true because all the scholars, the ulama, the clerics, they look at this obligation to abolish slavery, and there's nothing really within the inheritance of Islamic jurisprudence or scripture that would justify it. But they say, well, actually, you know what? It was always there. It was always implicit. Muhammad may have owned slaves, but secretly he wanted to abolish it. It may say that, in the Quran, that it's fine for people to own slaves, but secretly it means to get rid of it. In our legal codes, it may say it's fine for people to own slaves, but the core message is that God actually wants to get rid of them. And what they're doing there is they're adopting a Protestant strategy, because Protestants have done exactly that. There is no explicit injunction in the Bible to get rid of slavery. There's quite a lot of passages in the Bible where slavery is entirely justified. The Protestant way around this is to say, well, the Spirit possesses you, it enlightens your soul, it enables you properly to understand the meaning of the Bible. And this Protestant understanding of Scripture is one that Muslim scholars increasingly adopt. So over the course of the 19th and 20th century, Islam is Protestantized, and Islam gets absorbed within the fabric of international law, and so do all the various Asian civilizations. And at the end of the Second World War, when Protestant Anglo-America and Western civilization generally is at its apogee, it's able to issue a kind of charter of human rights under the aegis of the United Nations, which fulfills all the universalist dreams that Christians had always done, but in a kind of drag. And the Charter of Human Rights are a Catholic medieval concept, but there's no mention of this in the United Nations, because if there were, no one would accept them. So it gets smuggled, it gets disguised, it gets dressed up. And the assumption is in the West that they are merely articulating something that everybody has. But this is not true. This is not true. As Western power recedes, so this becomes to seem ever more a kind of an expression of cultural conceit. They don't have notions of Western human rights in China. They don't have them even in Japan. Many Muslims profoundly resent and regret the degree to which Islam has been, as they see it, gelded and rendered compatible with an alien framework of human law. They want to get back to God's law, which was believed in absolutely before the coming of the West with their Christian notions. And a lot of the fracturing of the world order at the moment is simply the fact that Western power is retreating it, and as it retreats, so also does the potency and the sustainability of the ideas that they had taken with them, and which they had, liberals had kind of convinced themselves that these weren't really culturally contingent, that they had emancipated themselves from their kind of their Christian cultural inheritance. Why couldn't everyone else do the same? But that in itself is a kind of Christian idea. And now the irony is that the less overtly Christian the West becomes, so the more it's being forced back onto the resources that Christianity historically has provided it with. But it can't see that, it doesn't recognise that, and I think that's a large part of the kind of the civilizational crisis that we're living through at the moment.
The problem is people like me, Christians who don't know they're Christians, Tom.
I think in your heart you do know that, and there's it's in a way, perhaps it's a testimony to the enduring hold of Christianity that you might shrink from acknowledging the debt that you owe to Christianity in a way that you wouldn't say with to Greek philosophy or something like that, because Greek philosophy is dead and buried. It's dead and buried. It's a dead thing, whereas Christianity is still very much a live thing, and so perhaps you retain a kind of Oedipal anxiety about that.
No, I think that's certainly true. That's certainly true. You have over the years helped me to understand the debt I owe Christianity.
But this is, I'm not talking as a theologian. I'm not talking as an apologist. I'm not talking about whether Christianity is real or not. I'm talking about it as a cultural phenomenon, a civilizational phenomenon. And it seems to me that the question of whether it's true or not is irrelevant to that. Its claims, if you're a believer, if you're a theologian, of course they matter hugely. But properly speaking, if you're looking at them as a historian, the question of whether God exists, whether Christ is the Saviour, that's irrelevant. People believe that, and their belief is a matter of history. But whether those beliefs are true or not is irrelevant.
Well, Tom, we covered a lot of history there. Thank you very much. What's the book called?
It's called Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind.
Go and buy it, everybody. Thanks for coming on the pod.
Thanks for having me.
I feel we had the history on our shoulders.
All the tradition of our